Hi, everyone. I'm Kavita Cardoza, and I am delighted to be here with our government and politics team, Daryl Burnett, Alison Klein, and Andrew Ujifusa. They write articles for the Politics K-12 blog and the State EdWatch blog. And together, they're responsible for about 60 articles a month at least. So as we call them at Ed Week, our resident slackers. They are so busy working, I often don't get a chance to ask them questions. So there's not a lot of around the water cooler conversation. So I thought of questions that I would want to ask if they stopped working. What can we expect from a Trump administration? What's going to be different from previous administrations?
So this is the first president that we've had since, I would say, the late 80s, right, with George H.W. Bush, who didn't come in with a clear vision that we all know about on what they want to do on education. So we've seen kind of the federal role build in some ways, over the last 4 administrations. We had the summit in Charlottesville that George H.W. Bush put together. We had Bill Clinton and Goals 2000 putting in standards and tests. We had No Child Left Behind, and then the Obama administration's race to the top. And now I feel like we're going to have a period where there's already was going to be a big step back in the federal role in education because of the Every Student Succeeds Act. And we have a president who's talked a lot about school choice and how important he feels that is, to the extent that he has talked about education. But in general, we just don't know a lot about where he stands on things like testing, accountability, school funding. I mean, there's just a ton of unanswered questions.
Yeah, I would also say, generally speaking, that we don't know where Trump might take an interest and become more proactive in a certain area, in part because of the lack of record that we have. He might take a big interest in career and technical education, for example, and do something very proactive there, and maybe displease some members of the Republican Party. But yeah, in a lot of ways, we just don't know.
What does his choice for Education Secretary, Betsy DeVos, tell us? Any indication there, what we might see?
So she has a long record of advocating for school choice vouchers, but also charter schools. She's done a lot of work at the state level. We don't know a ton about her positions on things like testing and accountability, but we certainly know that school choice is really important to her. Trump's main education proposal during the campaign was a $20 billion program that could be used for vouchers or other types of school choice. So the selection of Betsy DeVos means that he's really going to take that seriously, I think, and potentially go big on that. But he also has a lot of other things, obviously, on his priority list, and we don't know exactly where education fits in all of that.
We've concentrated a lot with the election about talking about the presidency. Daryl, what does the political landscape look like at the state level?
Yes, so with this last election, the Republicans hold about 31 governor seats, and about 32 states are controlled by, both their chambers are controlled by Republicans. So the Republicans swept a large swath of the country. Obviously, with ESSA, states will have a lot more say as to how they can shape their education policy, and a lot of state legislatures are very eager to get their hands on state ed policy. Obviously, they've been complaining for a long time that while they sort of share the large cost of education, they don't get a lot of say as to sort of where they're spending that money. So I would look toward the governor's State of the State addresses this year to kind of see where, especially how they write their budgets, where they are going to invest. I've heard a lot that a lot of states are going to put their education agendas, their prior education agendas back on the front burner. So it should be an interesting year next year.
Is the breakdown approximately 10% of money comes from the feds and the rest state and local, is that right?
Yes, state and local. And okay. There's been a large push in the last years for states to pick up even more cost. And I mean, I don't know if anybody's ever looked at their state budget, but it's a large portion of your taxes, and that's kind of putting it simply, goes into K-12. It's a very, very expensive endeavor.
Mm-hmm. What does you mentioned ESSA, ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act. What can we expect in general?
Under a Trump administration? So I think that is still a question hanging out there. Mr. Trump didn't really bring up ESSA on the campaign trail, but I think that we can expect, first of all, that some of the Obama administration's more controversial regulations, including on a wonky spending provision known as supplement not supplant, and you're definitely an education nerd if you know what supplement not supplant is, but those regulations will likely be struck down by a Republican Congress. There's also speculation, and we don't know for sure yet, that the department might, be a little bit more, give states a little more leeway and flexibility in improving their plans. They're not, if they just generally feel like they're headed in the right direction, they'll give them the okay, whereas it's possible that certainly the Obama administration and maybe a Clinton administration would have scrutinized certain sections of state plans a little more. So we already knew states were going to be leading, but now we know for sure. With a Republican Congress and a Republican presidency, that states are going to be where the action is on ed policy.
Yeah, I mean, I've been covering state politics for about a year now, and I jumped in at a really interesting time. The amount of activity that's happening between several factors within states, so governors, state boards of education, state chiefs. There's been a lot of dialogue in states through these sort of statewide tours on engaging on what they want in their ESSA plans. A lot of conversation on what role testing should play, what does success mean, what does a high school diploma mean. There have been some very ESSA is one of the first major federal legislation that actually requires input from both civil rights organizations, from legislatures and governors specifically. And so there's just a very public conversation. I expect that conversation to sort of get even louder as the legislative session opens up. Several states have actually already completed drafts of their ESSA plans, and they plan on pushing it through the legislature in case any laws need to be changed or in case they need to sort of set aside some money. So again, it'll be an interesting year next year.
We're going to start taking questions from the audience in a few minutes. So if you've got a question, please feel free to line up near the mic. And while we're waiting for that, what about unions? It seems like unions, I would get emails or on Twitter see, union activity all the time. And what's going to be their role now under Trump administration?
So I would say that they are going to have less power than they certainly would have under a Clinton administration. They really went all in on Hillary Clinton, endorsed her really early. In that way, the leadership of the unions alienated some of their members who'd been hoping for a little more consideration for Bernie Sanders.
And we should say, I think the results say 1 out of every 3 NEA members voted for Trump, and 1 out of every 5 AFT members voted for Trump. Okay.
So, but that does mean that a third or a quarter of their membership is excited about, or at least on board with this presidency, so that maybe could give them an opening. However, they did put out very quickly very negative statements about Betsy DeVos, Trump's choice of an education secretary. So it would seem, difficult to oppose somebody's confirmation and then work with them. That'll put them in a tough position.
At the state level, these relationships are a little bit more complicated. Obviously, unions have lost a lot of bargaining rights in recent years, but legislatures do not want to upset teachers because there are so many of them. In a lot of areas, the school districts are the largest employers. And obviously, ESSA allows for teachers to be at the table when they are creating state plans. And so I've seen some teacher activists that I flew to Oklahoma this year to cover at least 40 teachers there actually ran for office. Teachers are they've sort of taken this anti-testing, anti-Common Core to heart. They want to get much more politically engaged. What that means as far as, the role of the unions take, whether they sort of lead this effort and can coalesce that into an actual movement at the State House or kind of convince governors to ease up on standards is sort of yet to be seen.
Mm-hmm. Andrew, I know you have said that this year we've seen the Republicans and the unions kind of come together, and you've described that relationship sometimes as frenemies. What are we going to see going forward?
I don't think we entirely know the answer yet. I think there could be some areas of common ground for those two groups. For example, Allison mentioned the Obama administration's proposed rules for spending and federal government spending. Both sides want that tossed, they want that gone, but I think it's important to remember that although there might be a few specific policy areas where they see eye to eye, especially in the early days of the Trump administration, there could be political dynamics that create a lot of disincentives for people on opposite sides to be seen as cooperating. And even though education isn't the highest profile issue, that might make them more skittish about collaborating or working together, even on discrete policy issues.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm a student here, a doc student in special education, and I was wondering if you could read the tea leaves at all for how the new administration will deal with students with disabilities and also English language learners.
So I think that's a really good question. In talking to some folks in the civil rights community, there's some concern based on a lot of the rhetoric that Mr. Trump used on the campaign trail, making fun of a disabled reporter, some of the things that he said about immigrants. We don't know if that was just campaign trail rhetoric and how it will translate into policy. And that's something I know that those groups will be closely watching. As we've been talking about, one of our big themes has been a lot of the action is going to be on the state level. So I think that state civil rights advocates are really getting engaged with leaders, local leaders, their state education chiefs and their governors to try to make sure those students are protected, at least under their plans for the Every Student Succeeds Act. In terms of just other federal policy, it's a really open question right now.
Hi, I'm Nancy Kober with the Center on Education Policy and Graduate School of Education here. One of the few things Trump said on the campaign trail was anti-Common Core, no more Common Core, which is very misleading because it was the states who make the decisions to adopt it. It's not necessarily the president can say no more. So gathering that there's enough Republican support to do something, what can the federal government really do? Do you think they'd have an anti-Common Core? I mean, would the federal government swing to the other way where they'd try to come up with some sort of federal pronouncement to end the Common Core that states have already adopted and by the studies we've done at the Center on Education Policy invested a great deal of time and effort, and teachers and administrators and state policy people invested a great deal of time and effort in getting it to the point where it's becoming implemented in classrooms.
And the new education secretary has said she's not a fan of the Common Core. So going forward?
What does that mean? So that's a really good question. The Every Student Succeeds Act includes a prohibition in it on the secretary from telling states which standards to use. But also the education secretary can't tell states which standards not to use. So there's really no way for a Trump administration, without reopening ESSA, to say you can't use the Common Core. They wouldn't be able to do that. But if you have a president and a secretary out there saying these standards are really bad, I mean, that's probably not awesome for them in terms of just, the public perception and just the political rhetoric. And certainly governors could decide to move away from those standards. A lot of states are revisiting their standards this year. That said, and I think Andrew has done a lot of reporting on this, most states, right, kept the, may have changed the branding on the Common Core, but their standards really look very similar to the Common Core standards, if you want to.
Exactly.
Well, yeah.
I think that for the most part, the standards have held up relatively well in states, at least in terms of their adoptions and what states have done or not done with them. But as Allison said, the bully pulpit does matter to a certain extent, and maybe it will matter to some states who will say, well, it's time for us to review our standards anyway. Maybe they haven't been working particularly well in our state. Maybe a lot of people in my state don't like them. So maybe we should do something at least nominally different or substantively different. So, but in terms of the federal policy, Allison is exactly right. There's pretty much no wiggle room for the federal government to say you have to get rid of the Common Core.
Hi there, I'm Abby Weiss, and I'm with Jumpstart. We're a national early education organization, so you can probably guess my question. Most of what we've heard about early education has really been about childcare from the president-elect and about paid parental leave for mothers. So I'm wondering, any guesses you have, tea leave reading, on what we can possibly expect in early ed and pre-K? Thanks.
So this is probably one of the very few areas where there's at least some bipartisan interest. I think the details are really TBD. Does anybody else have anything to add to that? But I think it's one of the few areas that you could see Democrats maybe lining up with the Trump administration.
Yeah, I mean, you could see some, I think just yesterday, right, the Obama administration announced preschool development grants, and maybe you could see that. The future of that particular program is uncertain, I believe, but maybe you could see Republicans and Democrats lining up behind something similar in Congress. But yes, I think the future is uncertain for that particular area, at least at the federal level.
Hi, Joel Packer, retired. I thought there'd be free food, that's why I came, but no. Actually, two questions. One, another change that's going to happen next year is there'll be a new chair of the House Education and the Workforce Committee. So John Klein is retiring. He cut a lot of bipartisan deals, ESSA, Child Care Development Block Grants, WIA, Head Start, et cetera. Virginia Fox is going to be the new chair. Curious what your thoughts are about what you see her role being. And the second question is, which relates to the previous one, what's your thoughts about funding? I mean, it seems to me there's going to be a big squeeze on funding, which is going to affect whether it's Head Start or Title I or all these other programs. So what's your reaction on either of those issues?
So on John Klein and Virginia Fox first, Joel basically said half the answer I was going to give, so, but that's okay.
I didn't say anything about Virginia Fox.
But as for Virginia Fox, she does not have, I think, the same reputation that Klein has had about in terms of cutting bipartisan deals. I think Klein was moving bills out of his committee very late this year that had unanimous or near unanimous support, which many people used to watching Congress would find surprising, especially so close to an election. Virginia Fox has been involved in shepherding through workforce legislation, I believe, in 2014. So it's not as if she doesn't have some experience in that area, but she has also been very, like many Republicans, very outspoken against the Obama agenda. And she, when I spoke to her recently, she didn't have many kind things to say about what Hillary Clinton was pitching either. So it will be interesting to see how she handles, and this segues into your second question, funding for the education department and programs like Title I and Title IV. In fact, somebody told me recently that you could see, in addition to a general budget squeeze, you could see a lot of competition between advocates for funding for Title I and funding for Title IV, sort of fighting over the shrinking or relatively static pots of money that are available. So that's one possibility.
And one thing Joel didn't say is that he was the premier education funding advocate for a very long time, and we talked to him very, very often about these across-the-board cuts that are known as sequestration. Right now, Congress is going to there's been an elusive long-term budget deal to alleviate those cuts. And now that we have Republicans in charge of not only the White House, but also both houses of Congress, it seems pretty likely that there could be a long-term budget deal, and what Joel used to call NDD, which is non-defense discretionary spending, almost as fun a wording as supplement, not supplant. But basically, that's the big part of the budget that includes education, healthcare, many domestic programs, would seem likely to be squeezed under just any sort of generic administration that's controlled by Republicans. That said, though, there are certain programs within the education department that Republicans have historically been big fans of. One of them is special education, IDEA state grants, and another is impact aid, which is money that goes out to military
families,
yes.
Native American reservations.
Yes, absolutely. Yep.
Yes, hi.
I'm Emily Hanford, and I'm a reporter from American Public Media. And I'm curious, given what the election has revealed in terms of divides between urban and rural areas in the United States, I'm curious what stories or issues you think reporters and policymakers and researchers have been missing about what's going on in rural schools?
I think that's a great question.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
One of the things that I find very fascinating that's happening in rural areas is a lot of the problems that we have typically associated with urban areas, everything from drugs, et cetera, poverty issues. A lot of that is now seeping into rural areas. I was kind of surprised talking to an Iowa superintendent recently that rural county there is almost like 98% free and reduced lunch. And this is sort of the downfall of the agricultural industry. And so what you're seeing is a lot of these rural areas are starting to empty out, and that means that they're going to have to, similar to urban areas, start closing schools. They're going to have budget cuts, laying off teachers, et cetera. School districts are typically the largest employers in some of these areas, and so you're feeling a lot of pains there. And I think one of the things that I'm going to be looking at is as states are developing these their ESSA plans, sort of what sort of turnaround strategies are they going to be using in these rural areas? I mean, SIG grants, or student improvement grants, school improvement grants, was very much sort of tailored toward the urban environment, but it's very difficult to fire an entire staff in a rural district or bring out a charter school into a rural district. So I think there's going to be some very interesting strategies as to how to sort of work with district staff members. I think state departments are going to sort of start taking on a lot of the roles as to supporting these districts. But I think there are going to be some very sort of interesting stories in the coming years, especially since states are going to have more say in education policy.
And just piggybacking on Daryl's point, I think one interesting thing to watch going forward will be, and many reporters are to a certain extent familiar with this dynamic, is how rural communities and schools react to any sort of widespread voucherizing, are either of those words, of education, and just if the federal government pushes really hard on that, because, bless you. If for people who look at Texas, for example, many might be familiar there with for many years the legislature has been debating vouchers. You might think that Texas is a very conservative state, it would be friendly to vouchers, but I think there are 1,000 school districts in Texas, something like that. Many of them are the largest employers in their cities or in their counties. So when you start talking to those folks back home about creating vouchers and potentially seeing it go big, that makes folks very nervous. And ultimately, I think that's a big reason why legislators have not been particularly keen to pick that up. So that will be one interesting thing to watch, I think.
And I'll just say one more thing quickly. I think career and technical education is definitely an area to keep your eye on. We've had about a decade or so of kind of college for everybody, post-secondary education for everybody, and a lot of school districts have been cutting or moving away from those programs. And I think that under a Trump administration and a Republican Congress, we're likely to see a resurgence of at least focus on career and technical education.
Let's take one question before we wrap up.
Hi, Luann McNair with the National Council of Teachers of English. Detroit parents have filed a lawsuit saying that their children have a fundamental right to literacy, and Michigan is saying no. Do you see this spreading to other states or becoming an issue at the federal level at all?
I'm very fascinated with that lawsuit. Essentially, there are a group of parents there that are arguing that my kids are graduating from school and can't read. Isn't that a violation of the Constitution? I mean, don't you guarantee? And in fact, in the language of the response from the state, they said, we have no obligation to teach you how to read, essentially. But I think that this is an interesting sort of take on what we typically see in the courts and states, which is, you're not giving us enough money. That's a much more difficult argument to make than these kids are not able to read. I mean, one of the things that a lot of school districts or a lot of parents have been buoyed by in recent years is sort of the No Child Left Behind and this movement towards starting to track exactly where kids are. So states are adopting standards, and then they're testing the kids as to where they are on standards. And parents and districts are using this in the courtroom. So they basically are just using this as sort of a way to prove to states that you are violating our constitutional rights. So it'll be interesting in the next couple of years to see sort of, how states respond to this, and if there are going to be other lawsuits in other states. I mean, marginally, the vast majority of funding lawsuits in states are relatively successful, despite a few, but I think this is sort of a unique take.
Okay. I think we're going to have to wrap up so we keep on schedule. Can we have a round of applause for our Education Week reporters? Thank you so much. Thank you.